Hi, my name's Caitríona. I'm one of the speech and language therapists in the Brothers of Charity Services Ireland Southern Region. My colleague Sarah and I are recording a series of short videos in order to introduce Aided AAC to family members and to educators, and we hope you find them useful. In the Brothers of Charity, we work with autistic people, or some people prefer the term people with autism. We work with people with an intellectual disability, and we work with people who have an intellectual disability and are autistic. So what is AAC? AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. If you're watching this video, it's likely that you know somebody for whom speech alone doesn't fully meet their communication needs. Maybe they find it difficult to understand other people's speech, or maybe they find that speech isn't efficient to get their own message across. It's important to keep in mind that research shows that using AAC doesn't hinder the development of speech, nor does it replace speech for those that already are using speech. AAC falls under two categories. Aided AAC is when you use some type of resource, and unaided AAC is when you use your hands, so sign language. Many of the young people that we support in the BOC use a combination of unaided and aided AAC, as well as speech to communicate. In these videos, we are going to be discussing aided AAC. There's a variety of different types of aided AAC. It could be as simple as using a pen and paper to draw or write. It could be texting or typing. Some AAC systems have a battery and a voice output component. Other AAC systems are pictures and symbols that are printed and laminated. No system is better than the other. It's all dependent on the communicator's individual needs. More specifically, in these videos, we're going to be discussing the types of systems that you see here in the pictures. So these are symbol-based systems, either with a battery and a voice output component, or low-tech systems, which are no-tech systems, which are printed and laminated. AAC systems might in fact change over the course of somebody's life. So some of our younger AAC learners, their speech and language skills might develop to such an extent that they actually no longer need AAC or need a modified AAC at certain times. Others of our AAC users will develop their literacy skills to such an extent that they no longer need a symbol-based system, and instead they prefer to type or text. I've probably used it already, but in these videos we're going to use the term language learner when we're referring to those people who are using or learning to use an AAC system. The language learner that you have in mind might look different to the language learner that somebody else is thinking of. They might be very young or a teenager or older. They might be able to speak, but other people find their speech difficult to understand. Others of our language learners have some speech, but they would benefit from the opportunity to learn more vocabulary and see how vocabulary can combine to create phrases and sentences. Yet more of our language learners have little or no speech, and they struggle to understand other people's speech. They need an alternative method of communicating to get their message across. There's one more group that we're going to keep in mind, and these are people who can speak and often have good language skills, but who lose access to their speech and language skills when they're feeling overwhelmed, maybe anxious or excited. We know about this because now people are blogging and telling us about this phenomenon, whereby when they're feeling dysregulated, they prefer other people to use alternatives to speech to communicate with them, and they like to have access to alternatives to speech to communicate themselves. We're also going to use the term communication partners. Communication partners are all those people who interact with the language learner on a day-to-day basis. Introducing AAC into somebody's life is challenging. It requires a big adjustment to day-to-day life, especially at the beginning, because a lot of input from communication partners is required, sometimes for months before an AAC user is up and running themselves with a system. Because of this, we really encourage as many communication partners as possible to come on board to support the AAC user and his or her immediate family. We encourage grannies and other family members, SNAs, teachers, and particularly siblings and peers to get involved as communication partners. And in these videos, we hope to explain how to be a good communication partner. Aided AAC falls under the broader category of total communication, whereby we use all means of communication in order to understand others and to make ourselves understood. We all use non-symbolic communication, such as body language, gesture, facial expression, and non-speech vocalization. It's also important to encourage the understanding and use of symbolic communication, such as sign, pictures, text, and speech. Symbolic and non-symbolic communication are equally as valid. However, non-symbolic communication is open to misinterpretation and is also open to being ignored. I used to work with a little girl who I'll call Mary, who really taught me this lesson. Mary was 6 years old, she was non-speaking, and she would use non-symbolic communication. At certain times during the day, her staff members in her school would present her with some pictures, maybe 2 to 4 pictures to make a choice. Mary used non-symbolic communication to express to us that she was feeling fairly unhappy in school. When it was time to transition between classes, she would drop to the floor. She would push certain tabletop activities away, and she would often stand by the window and point out. When we were trialing a voice output system with Mary, on the first day she found the word home and she pressed it repetitively. When I came back to the school a few days later, a staff member said, "We're going to have to get rid of that word home on the system because that's all she keeps pressing and that's all she's using it for." Of course, we didn't get rid of the word home because in fact Mary had been communicating to us for a long time that she wanted to go home. But now her communication was less easy to ignore and was less open to misinterpretation. Because Mary was now self-advocating, we as communication partners had the onus on us to stop and change our practice. For the first time, we could meaningfully acknowledge to Mary what she was communicating. So on the system, we could acknowledge that she wanted to go home, and we could take a guess that maybe she wanted to see mom and dad, and maybe she didn't like this particular activity. We also took the time to ensure that there was visuals in place to show Mary exactly when she would be going home and what would be the steps that would have to occur between now and then. And finally, we took the time to reflect on Mary's day and try to figure out why she was feeling so unhappy. We thought about making activities more meaningful to her and infusing her interests into the day so that she would be more happy in her placement. So Mary's self-advocacy with symbolic communication was very effective. When considering AAC systems, it's important to ask yourself whether the system you're considering is robust. So the first point about a robust system is that it should be always available. If we think back to Mary, she was offered pictures during the day, but only at certain times. So for her her symbolic communication was severely limited for most of the day. The other thing to think about is, does the system have a lot of vocabulary? Again, in Mary's case, she was offered pictures, but these were limited in their capacity. So I think she was offered pictures so that she could make a choice at snack time and then also make a choice of activities at downtime. But the word that she wanted to communicate the most, which was home, was not available to her at that time. Lastly, you want to consider whether the system has an element of motor planning. Motor planning basically means that the pictures and symbols don't move around that much. So as you know, when you use an ATM PIN or unlock your phone with a password, the more times you do it, the more automatic you become, and you don't hardly need to look at the numbers anymore. Similarly with Aided AAC, if the symbols and pictures don't move around, you become more automatic and more fluent in using them. And it's not necessary to scan each picture and look closely, as your hand almost remembers instinctively where to go. With regard to vocabulary selection, it's important to include both core and fringe vocabulary. Core vocabulary is that vocabulary which can be used in activities throughout the day. It's high-frequency vocabulary, and as a result, it's usually put on the home screen of voice output devices, and with low-tech systems, it's always available. Core vocabulary is difficult to take a picture of, so we use symbols instead. An example would be the word go. It's difficult to take a photo of that word, so often a green arrow is used instead. A word like go can be used throughout the day. So for example, when you're saying in the morning, time to go to school, or when you're playing a game, you might say ready, steady, go. Or when you're asking a question, you might say, where did daddy go? Core words are so valuable that even a few small core words can be used very effectively. Again, thinking back to Mary, even if she hadn't the word home, but she did have the word go, she would be able to communicate to other people that she wanted to leave. Equally as important as core is fringe vocabulary. Fringe vocabulary refers to that vocabulary that we use only in specific occasions during a day. So for example, if you think of the word bread, it's a very important word, but you'd only maybe say bread once or twice a day in specific situations. Fringe vocabulary and core vocabulary together can combine to make phrases and sentences and can be the basis of communication. So when you have a system, you have to consider whether it has core and fringe. The last thing to keep in mind is personal core. This refers to vocabulary that is so personally important to an individual that it actually becomes as important as core to them. So, for example, if you were working with maybe a 9-year-old boy who's incredibly into the Green Lantern, and you'd have to think about, if he wanted to have a conversation about the Green Lantern right now, how easy is it for him to do that? Consider the system and think, do I need to add vocabulary? Do I need to move any vocabulary around? Can I use the vocabulary that's there to have a good chat with him about the Green Lantern and the Green Lantern Corps and all of the things that he's really interested in? Thanks so much for tuning into this video, which was the first in our series. Please tune in to the next video where Sarah will be discussing how to go about introducing AAC.